Most of us have felt it at some point. You walk into a space you know completely, and something is wrong before you can name what it is. Not a sound, not a sight, just an absence. A quiet that doesn't belong there. People who work land every day develop that feeling in a particular way. It comes through the body before it reaches the mind, the way a horse slows without being told to, the way a hand moves toward a rifle before there's a conscious reason to move it. Holt McCready felt it the moment he crested the rise that morning and looked down at his lower pasture. He had worked that stretch of ground for 14 years. He knew what it was supposed to look like at dawn, the shapes of animals in the grey light, the slow drift of breath rising above the scrub, 34 head of cattle moving the way cattle move in the morning, heavy and unhurried. What he saw instead was an empty field, not thin, not scattered to another corner of the property. Empty. And standing in the center of it, alone and perfectly still, watching him from 30 yards away, was a young Apache woman he had never seen before in his life. She was not hiding. That was the first thing he registered. She stood in the open, maybe 30 yards from the nearest fence post, wearing a deerskin dress that had dried mud along the hem. Her hair was loose, and she carried nothing visible in her hands. She appeared young, late teens, maybe 20, and she was watching him with the kind of steadiness that is not accidental. Not the stillness of someone startled into freezing, but the deliberate stillness of someone who has been waiting and has now decided to be seen. She did not run when he started down the slope toward her. She did not step back or reach for anything. She simply stood there in the empty field where his livelihood should have been and waited for him to come to her. Holt McCready was 47 years old and had spent the last 14 of those years on this stretch of frontier land, and he had developed over that time the specific quality of attention that the land demands from the people who stay on it. He noticed things. He had noticed, for instance, that for the past 4 mornings there had been signs of movement on the far ridge to the north. Not animals, but people, the kind of tracks that belong to individuals moving with intention rather than wandering. He had noticed that his cattle had been restless for 3 evenings running, shifting in the night and pressing against the south fence in a way they did not normally do. He had filed these things away without yet knowing what they added up to. Now, standing at the edge of the empty pasture in the growing light, he had the specific sensation of pieces locking together into a shape he did not yet fully see, but could already tell was not going to be simple. He dismounted about 15 feet from her, kept his hands visible and his voice low. She was Apache. The beadwork on the dress, the way she carried herself, something in the quality of the stillness she occupied. He had lived adjacent to Apache people for long enough to understand that most of what the territory's settlers believed about them was either wrong or strategically incomplete, and he had long since stopped filtering what he saw through what he had been told to expect. He looked at her and saw a young woman who had come to a specific place at a specific time for a reason she had decided was worth the considerable risk of standing in a stranger's open field at dawn. "Morning," he said. She looked at him without expression. Not afraid, not hostile. The look of someone who has already made their calculations and is simply verifying the result. Then she said, "Your cattle are dead, all 34 of them, and the men who killed them are still on your land." Holt did not move for a moment. The words landed in the silence of the empty pasture, the way a stone lands in still water, rippling outward, changing the shape of everything around them. He looked at her steadily. She was not constructing a story. He had lived long enough to know the difference between someone who is lying and someone who is delivering a fact they have already accepted, however unwilling the recipient might be to receive it. Her face was completely flat, with the flatness of someone who has processed something terrible and is now simply passing it forward. "How many men?" he said. "4 that I saw clearly. A 5th who stayed back." She met his eyes without wavering. "They are in the cut canyon past your second water tank. Horses hidden in the brush above the drop. They have been there since before dark last night." He looked east, the line of red rock formations at the far edge of the property. The Eastern Cut, he called it, a narrow, shadowed canyon he had ridden through hundreds of times, the kind of place you did not enter at night unless you knew it thoroughly. These men, whoever they were, had been in it since before dark. That was not carelessness. That was planning. If you're the kind of person who stays with a story all the way to where it leads, this is a good time to hit that like button. It keeps these stories coming, and this one is only getting started. He asked her how she knew all of it. She told him. Her people camped 2 ridges north and had been moving through this corridor of land for longer than the fences had been here. She knew every canyon in this valley, the way a person knows a house they grew up in, not just its rooms, but its sounds, its habits, the way it changes at different hours. She had been in the Eastern Cut the previous evening checking the water source when the men arrived. She had climbed the canyon wall and pulled herself into a crevice in the rock and stayed there. She had watched the entire thing. She had counted his cattle going in and counted them again afterward. When it was done, the man leading the operation, tall, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a grey coat with something marked on the back, had spoken quietly to the others before they settled in to wait. She had not caught all of it, but she had caught enough. He had said something about a deed office, something about a man named Pitfield being pleased when he came to make the offer. The name hit Holt somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. Crane Pitfield was a land agent who operated out of the nearest town with the easy confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged on anything. He presented himself as a broker, a legitimate middleman between sellers and buyers, a practical solution for ranchers who found themselves in difficult positions. The reality of his operation, as Holt had come to understand it over the past 2 years, was something considerably less legitimate and considerably more practiced. A rancher ran into trouble, cattle went missing, a water source dried up, a barn burned on a calm night with no lightning for 50 miles, and then Pitfield appeared, sympathetic, unhurried, already holding a piece of paper with a number written on it. Low, always low, but calculated. Calibrated to the exact degree of desperation a man reaches when he has looked at his losses long enough and cannot see a way forward that doesn't involve taking whatever is offered. 3 ranchers Holt knew personally had sold to Pitfield in the past 18 months. One had taken his family east. The other 2 were still in the territory, working other men's land, their own operations dissolved, like they had never existed. Holt had turned Pitfield down twice, both times without anger and without ambiguity. He had suspected that the patience on the other side of those refusals was not unlimited. Looking at his empty pasture now, it appeared it had run out. He rode to the Eastern Cut alone and went in carefully and found his cattle. It took less than 20 minutes, and each of those minutes was its own particular devastation. The animals had been driven in through the upper entrance and killed efficiently, in near silence, by men who knew what they were doing and had done it before. Holt sat on his horse in the shadowed canyon and looked at the full scope of what it meant, and he felt something very specific move through him that was not yet grief and not quite rage, but the cold, focused clarity that arrives when a man understands he is looking at something deliberate. This was not violence for its own sake. This was an instrument. A step in a process that had been planned calmly at a desk somewhere by someone who had done the arithmetic on how long it takes a man to break. He rode back to the pasture. She was still there. "Tell me everything," he said, dismounting. "From the beginning." Her name, she told him, was something in Apache that translated to roughly the quality of light that exists just before actual dawn, when the sky is neither dark nor bright, but its own distinct thing between the two. What people called her, shortened by use, was Saya, He could call her that. He did. She told him the rest of what she had seen and heard from the canyon wall, and she described the men with the precision of someone who tracks, not cataloging details but reading them, understanding what they meant rather than merely what they appeared to be. The leader's scar. The way the fifth man held himself on the rim, watchful and separate, clearly not one of the workers but not the employer either. Something in between. An overseer. Someone who had been sent to witness, not to do. It was that detail that completed the picture Holt had been building since she first spoke. A witness sent by Pitfield made sense. Insurance that the job was done before an offer was made. But there was another kind of witness who might want to stand on a canyon rim at night and watch a man's cattle be destroyed. The kind who wore a sheriff's badge. Aldous Reeves had been the county sheriff for 9 years, which was long enough in that territory for a man to either become genuinely useful to the community he served or genuinely owned by whoever had the most resources. Holt had formed his opinion of Reeves early and had seen nothing in the years since to revise it. He had simply avoided the man when possible and given him no cause for attention. But Pitfield moved through that county the way water moves through sand, gradually, thoroughly finding every gap. And a sheriff who had been in his orbit for 9 years was not a sheriff Holt could take a report to and expect anything useful to come of it. This was the problem he sat with that evening on the steps of his ranch house, with the rifle across his knees and the dark pressing in from every side. He could not go to the law. He could not fight 4 men in a canyon, 5 if the man on the rim came down. He could not absorb the loss and stay solvent. And Pitfield would come, within a day, maybe 2, with his piece of paper and his sympathetic expression and his number already written down. And by then Holt would have spent enough hours looking at what remained of everything he had built that the number would look different than it would have yesterday. Subscribe to the channel before you go any further, because what happened next is the part that changes how you think about all of it. Saya came back the next morning before he had finished his coffee. She stood at the gate rather than in the field this time, which was its own small change in the nature of things between them. She had something to tell him that she had not told him the day before, because the day before she had not yet spoken to her grandmother about whether to say it. Her grandmother had been on the North Ridge the previous evening. Not at the canyon, but at a higher point, further out, with a clear angle across the full width of the eastern cut. From that position she had seen the 5th man on the rim. She had seen him clearly enough and for long enough to describe him in detail. When Saya delivered the description, Holt felt the final piece of it settle into place with a weight that was almost physical. The 5th man on the rim had been Aldous Reeves. There are moments in a man's life when something he suspected becomes something he knows, and the distance between those two things is larger than it appears from the outside. Holt sat with it for a long moment. Then he asked Saya if her grandmother would be willing to tell what she had seen to someone other than him, someone with the authority to act on it. Saya looked at him in the way she had looked at him from the beginning, carefully, reading the territory of the question before answering it. Then she said she would ask. The land commissioner's name was Harlan Croft. He kept an office in a town 2 days' ride south and held his appointment from the territorial government, which meant his jurisdiction sat above the county level and did not pass through Aldous Reeves to get anywhere. Holt had met him once, years back, at a meeting about water rights, and had come away with the impression of a man who found certain kinds of people genuinely inconvenient, specifically the kind who preferred their arrangements to stay unexamined. That impression had seemed like a minor observation at the time. It seemed considerably more significant now. He made the ride in a day and a half. Croft listened to everything without interrupting. When Holt finished, the commissioner picked up a pencil and wrote 3 things on a piece of paper. Then he said, "If what you're describing holds up, this is the 4th operation of this kind in this territory in 2 years. He paused. "I want the Apache witnesses available. I understand the practical complications. I don't particularly care about the practical complications." He stood up. "Don't go back to the canyon alone." He did not need to. When he returned to the ranch, Pitfield was already on the porch steps, hat in hand, face arranged into the expression of a man who has come to perform sympathy. He had heard about the cattle, a terrible loss, these elements of lawlessness that persisted on the frontier. He happened to have a buyer who had expressed interest in this particular parcel, good land, reliable access to water, and if Holt was in a position where he needed to consider his options. Holt stood in his own yard and looked at the man for a long moment. Then he said, "I spoke with Harlan Croft 4 days ago." He let it sit in the air. "He's sending 2 investigators up from the south within the week. They'll want to speak with you about several land transactions going back 2 years. Another pause. "They'll also want to speak with Sheriff Reeves about where he was on the night of the 15th. He watched Pitfield's face go through 3 distinct expressions: surprise, the fast mathematics of calculation, and then something that almost looked like reluctant respect, before it hardened into something else entirely. "You can't prove anything," Pitfield said. His voice had dropped the sympathy. It was flat now, the voice of a man speaking from behind a desk. "I have witnesses," Holt said. "More than you'd expect." He said nothing further. He let the man work out for himself where witnesses might have come from, and what they might have seen from a canyon rim on a dark night that a man in a grey coat had not thought to account for. Pitfield left without another word. The men in the eastern cut were gone by that afternoon. Tell us in the comments, if you had been standing in that empty pasture that morning, would you have ridden toward her or turned back? We want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. It did not end cleanly. These things rarely do. The investigation that followed took months and was contentious in the way that all investigations are contentious when powerful men have lawyers and connections and the patience to make things slow. Reeves resigned his position before the investigators arrived, which spared him a formal charge but did not spare him his reputation. 2 of the men from the canyon were eventually identified and faced consequences, though not as severe as the crime warranted. Pitfield's land company came under formal review, and 2 of the most recent acquisitions were reversed under terms that were not fully explained in the public record. The former owners recovering their deeds through a process that no one described out loud as justice, but that everyone involved understood to be as close to it as the machinery of that era could produce. Saya's grandmother gave her account to Croft's investigators in the specific unhurried way she had done everything else, completely, without embellishment, with the authority of someone who has spent a lifetime reading land and knows the difference between what she saw and what she assumed. She named the hour, the position, the light conditions, the details of clothing. She did not hedge. The investigators, who had expected to receive something vague and second-hand, received instead the most precise account in their entire record. It became the document everything else was built around. Holt repaired his operation over the following year. It was slow. A man does not replace 34 head of cattle quickly when he is working with what remains after a loss of that kind. But he was not starting from nothing, and he had spent enough years being patient that patience was not a new requirement. He rebuilt the south herd first and expanded his rotation of the pasture sections in a way that kept the eastern creek bank protected, which had not been planned with Saya's people in mind, but which meant, in practice, that the corridor they used each season moved through cleaner land than it had before. Nobody discussed this arrangement formally. Nobody needed to. Saya came back twice that summer with information that proved useful. A report of riders moving through the North Ridge that turned out to be associates of Pitfield's testing, whether the investigation had slowed the broader operation, which it had, and the location of a spring in the southeast rock formation that Holt had not known existed, which mattered considerably in the dry months, and which she shared without preamble or expectation of anything in return. He listened and acted on what she told him. She offered what she knew without requiring him to ask for it. It was not friendship in the way that word typically gets used. It was something more functional, and perhaps for that reason more durable. Two people who paid close attention to the same piece of land and had come to understand that the paying of attention was easier when it was shared. There is a version of this story that flattens it into something simpler. A good man helped by a brave girl. A corrupt scheme exposed. Justice, approximately. But the truth of it was more tangled and more interesting than that, as the truth of things generally is. What Saya had done on that morning in the empty pasture was not straightforward. She had crossed open ground alone to warn a man she had never spoken to about a crime she had witnessed from hiding, at a risk to herself and her family that she had weighed carefully and accepted. She had done it because what she had seen was wrong, and because silence felt to her like its own kind of participation in the wrong. And she had done it because Holt had spent 14 years keeping his land in a way that said, without ever saying it, that the people who moved through it were not threats to be managed, but neighbors to be acknowledged. That is the part that tends to get left out of the simpler version. That the warning was not random. That the 3 mornings of movement on the North Ridge had not been surveillance born from suspicion, but from the careful practice of a people who do not approach strangers until they are reasonably certain of what they are approaching. That Saya had stood in that empty field, not because she had stumbled into it, but because she had decided, after watching and weighing and consulting, that he was the kind of man who would hear what she had to say and do something useful with it. She had been right. And he had been, for reasons that had nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with 14 years of paying attention to something larger than himself. Ready to hear it. The marker Saya's grandmother left on his gatepost that autumn was a piece of worked leather, small and marked with symbols he could not read. What it meant, Saya told him when she brought it, was that the land behind this gate was safe to approach. That any of her people who found it would know they could come down off the ridge without having to spend 3 mornings reading the land first. He nailed it to the post without ceremony and left it there through winter and into the following spring, where it weathered but held. The first riders who came through the following summer saw it from a distance as it was intended to be seen, and came through the gate without hesitation because someone they trusted had told them what it meant. And it meant what it said, that was all. In a territory full of things that meant something other than what they appeared to, it meant exactly what it said. And that, in its way, was the rarest thing of all. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever spoken up for someone when you didn't have to? When staying quiet would have been easier and no one would have blamed you for it? We read every comment. And there are more stories from the frontier coming, each one with something worth carrying with you.